Hi, welcome to Diving into Government ESL style. My name is Michelle Portera, and if you've been tuning in with me and my friend Miss Fuller, you've learned about the federal and state government as well as citizens' rights and responsibilities. Since we live in a democratic country, we the people share power with the government. I'm here to talk about something that is both a right and a responsibility. The right to vote. When citizens turn 18, they are able to vote in state and federal elections. But it hasn't always been that simple. Many people did not always have the right to vote. And some fought hard to make sure everyone had the same amount of power in choosing our elected officials. Today, I hope we learn the history so we can understand just how fortunate we are to benefit from the work of those before us. A language goal of this lesson is to identify metaphors relating to the government, much like the idioms we saw in the previous lesson. Are you ready to dive into the history of women's suffrage in America? Let's go. The right to vote is called suffrage, although it is not referring to actual suffering, even though it sounds like it. It is from the Latin suffragium, meaning the right to vote. Women were not given the right to vote when the Constitution was written, only men. White men in particular, because they could own land, which was the requirement for suffrage at the time. Women who worked toward obtaining voting rights were called suffragettes. Voting rights are protected by law and have been referred to as the vehicle that drives our government in a way that serves the people. And here, my friends, is our first metaphor. Metaphors are similar to idioms, very similar in fact. They are almost the same thing, except that an idiom is a phrase used as a figure of speech, and it helps define something. A metaphor directly refers to one thing by mentioning another. For example, voting is the vehicle. Take the idiom hand in hand we saw in the last lesson. That three-word phrase helps explain a concept, where the vehicle metaphor lets us know that voting can be visualized as a car, moving toward creating change. So a metaphor is a figure of speech that describes an object or action in a way that isn't literally true, but helps explain an idea or make a comparison. A metaphor states that one thing is another thing. It says that two things are equal, not because they are actually the same, but for the sake of comparison or symbolism. And if you take a metaphor literally, it will probably sound very strange. Can you see how vehicle has both the literal and a figurative meaning? Vehicle literally means something that transports something else, like a car or a plane. But figuratively, it means something that can bring about change in the government, especially so that the people feel happier with life in the United States. Let's look at some of the suffragettes who tirelessly worked so women could vote in America. This is Carrie Chapman Catt, and she founded the League of Women Voters. And she provides us with another metaphor to consider today. She said, "The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty." We can understand voting from the female perspective by thinking of it as an emblem or a badge that signifies our freedom. We know lots of logos or emblems. Just think of fast food restaurants, like the golden arches of McDonald's, or the logo on the tags of your favorite brand of clothing, the icons on your computer, anything that serves to identify a specific thing and sets it apart from the rest. How many emblems can you think of? Susan B. Anthony began her career as an abolitionist. That's one of those words that, just like Miss Fuller taught us to do, we probably need to break that down into parts. Repeat after me, abolitionist. Now let's clap that. Abolitionist. And that means someone who worked to end slavery. In her social justice work, she felt that equality meant including people of color and women and allowing them the same rights as white men. Her work as an abolitionist, what is that again? What does that mean? Did I hear you say someone who worked to end slavery? You're paying attention. Her work as an abolitionist provided her with lots of experience in leadership and organization, and that led to her accomplishments we celebrate today. She was president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She worked closely throughout her career with a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, most notably in writing the 19th Amendment. It was finally passed in 1920. It took a while from the time they wrote it to the time it was actually passed. She can be seen on the 1979 silver dollar. Those are rare these days, so if you come across one, hold on to it. Now let's talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the other half of the suffragette dream team. She did most of the writing for the women's rights movement, while Susan B. Anthony handled most of the business affairs. Together, they created the American Equal Rights Association. She worked to abolish slavery, so she was an abolitionist. She worked to reform women's dress to make it more simple and practical, because at the time they had the petticoats and the corsets, and it was hard for women to move at that time if they wanted to do anything except stand up and walk around and sit down. So we have her to thank for women's dress reform. And also she worked on divorce reform, because at the time it heavily favored men. So she wrote a book entitled The Women's Bible. And this book pointed out the Bible's bias toward women and challenged the idea that women should be submissive to men. Very controversial at the time, and even now. So to use an idiom to describe these women, they were on fire. No, they did not need the fire department. Suffragettes were passionate and worked relentlessly for years and years to change the rules. They worked for what they believed in. Susan B. Anthony was arrested for casting her vote for president. She didn't care. She did it for her cause. Women were often kicked out of meetings. They were loud and rebellious in their protests. They were passionate. But make no mistake, there were also men who advocated for women's rights as well. It wasn't like men versus women at the time. This was all about the idea of power. And one of the men who also worked towards women's rights was Frederick Douglass, who you may have heard of. In general, a woman's accepted role was in the home and in the home only. I wonder, can you think of something that fires you up? What do you feel passionate about? What are the things that would cause you to be willing to get in trouble for speaking out about? I can tell you one thing that fires me up: when people throw trash on the ground. Sometimes you can be driving down the road and someone will throw their trash out the window. That fires me up. So I'm sure there's a few things you could think of as well. People on both sides of the argument campaigned. That means that they used their right for free speech to share their ideas and try to gain a following for what they believed. And here you can see an example of a pamphlet explaining why women should not be involved in politics. And this was sort of disguised as household hints to reach the ordinary women that were at home. And this is from I think this is the Jewish Women's Library. I'll be able to tell you in a little while the exact name. But I thought it was interesting to share with you that it says because 90% of the women either do not want it or do not care. So they were using a lot of kind of peer pressure. Everybody else is voting no, so you vote no. Because it means competition of women with men instead of cooperation. Because 80% of the women eligible to vote are married and can only double or annul their husband's votes. Because it can be of no benefit commensurate with the additional expense involved. So basically it would cost more. And because in some states, more voting women than voting men will place the government under petticoat rule. The women would be in charge. And because it is unwise to risk the good we already have for the evil which may occur. All of these arguments made sense at the time. Now look at this one from the Jewish Women's Archives. This one used the daily tasks of housewives to explain why they didn't need the right to vote. And it created fear about what might happen if they had this right. You do not need a ballot to clean out your sink spout. And then it says a handful of pot ash and some boiling water is quicker and cheaper. And it goes on to mention all different kinds of household tasks. Control of the temper makes a happier home than control of elections. Good cooking lessons alcoholic craving quicker than a vote. Why vote for pure food laws when your husband does that? Well, you can purify your icebox with a word that I don't know, water. That is a vocabulary word I will look up because that's what we should do when we don't know what a word means. Clean your mirrors with water, to which a little glycerin has been added. This prevents steaming and smoking. So you can see they did a good job of embedding their arguments into the household tasks. After listing spot removing advice, it says, there is, however, no method known by which mud-stained reputations may be cleaned after bitter political campaigns. And this refers to another metaphor in government, mud. Mudslinging means harsh insults exchanged in a political campaign. Have you ever been involved in mudslinging with your siblings? It's possible that we've all done this at some point. Of course we apologize later because we know how to be respectful. Women's suffrage began as a grassroots campaign. And that means that it began with a group of ordinary people in a community instead of people already involved in government. They didn't treat government as someone else's job. They took it upon themselves. The people in the community are the ones who took responsibility. Wait a minute, that sounds familiar. What was that word we learned that meant members of a community? Did I hear you say citizens? Yes, you are so smart. You can see the true meaning of the metaphor on the left with this very serious and enthusiastic woman saying, give me a vote and see what I can do. And then you see the literal grassroots on the right. It's worth noting that the women's suffrage movement officially lasted 72 years. So many of the activists didn't live to see the results of their work. In reality, there were activists as soon as the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776, only giving landowners the right to vote. But things really began to pick up in 1848 at the Seneca Falls, New York Women's Rights Convention. Just like with other issues, change happened gradually across the nation. Some states granted women's rights quickly, and some held out until the federal government required them to change. That happened in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. However, there was still the issue of race. Sure, women could vote, but what about women of color? It all depended on where you were in the country and who was working at the voting polls. In areas where very little discrimination occurred, it wasn't a problem. But in places where prejudice was common, there were tactics people used to keep women of color out of government. This goes back to what Ms. Fuller was telling us about the different branches of government having different powers. And when it came down to it, the local state government had power at the polls. And so there were different ways that they could choose to treat people that were lining up to vote. And this was the problem. And so that's why it was necessary to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This made it clear that people of color were allowed to vote, and it made discrimination illegal. Do you remember that word? Discrimination, from the last time we were together? Can you remember what it means? Yeah, I knew you would remember. Would you read the definition along with me? Discrimination is the unjust treatment of different categories of people, especially on race, age, or gender. Now that you know a little about voting history and citizens' rights, I wonder if you will think differently about current events. Does it cause you to ask new questions? Your challenge going forward is to watch the news and notice if voting rights are still in question even now. Did it end with the Voting Rights Act in 1965? What needs to happen now? And how can ordinary citizens bring about change? Another challenge I leave you with is this. How many idioms and metaphors can you find in one day? This can be through listening to others speak or reading. Write them down and define them. Remember, they don't normally match. The meaning normally doesn't match the words that are used. It's really hard to decipher what the meaning might be. So you may have to look it up to define them. You'll be surprised at just how common they are in the everyday world. One of the metaphors that we've seen in this series is the branches of government, where we say the government has three parts or three branches. There's been so many things that we've seen on this deep dive into government together, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as Ms. Fuller and I did. We learned about the federal government and the state government. We also learned some language things along the way. We worked on our pronunciation, and we also learned about figures of speech like metaphors and idioms. We learned about which parts of the government or which branches have which powers. We also learned about citizens, what a good citizen does, what a good citizen is, and how we can become better citizens. What are our rights and responsibilities? Because if we learn how to use our rights in a responsible way, we will be even better citizens and our world will be a better place. And then today you learned a little bit of history about women's suffrage and how some ideas that some people had a while ago have affected our lives even today. So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into government. I hope you'll continue to tune in for more lessons like this one. You are part of the next generation of people who create the change in America. And the more you know, the better you will be at it and the easier it will be for you. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.